nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Param Bhojo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Adadana Strinam Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Param Bhojo Dilisam Janma Janmani Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyaiva cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. So by the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the foremost of Gaudiya Vaishnava Acharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali, Sri Rupa Pad's compilation of verses composed by various bhakti rasakas about Krishna, Krishna Bhajan, Krishna Lila, and so forth. So in our last reading, we discussed verse 8, with the theme of which was that Bhagavān is satisfied by bhakti and not by qualities in general, be it knowledge or maturity or social status or what have you. So today we'll come to verse 9. So this is again inside the prakaran on bhajana mahatmya, or the greatness of bhajan, the greatness of Krishna bhajan. So the previous verse then stated that why is bhajan great? Because it's the only thing that pleases Bhagavān. So now that that's been stated, the topic that comes in the next verse is a distinction then between bhakti and karma in general. So we heard a distinction between bhakti and qualities. Now we're going to get a distinction between bhakti and action, or actions that are distinct from bhakti, as bhakti can also be defined as an action, as Rupa Goswami defines it as anushilana. And the shield dhatu, Jiva Goswami takes to mean a placeholder for every dhatu, meaning that every single possible action can itself be an act of Krishna Anushilanam, or an act of service to Krishna, provided it is possessed of favorability. So anyway, those are points about the definition of Uttama Bhakti. So distinguishing then bhakti as an action from karma, and karma here meaning action in general, and more specifically karma in the sense of the path of karma defined in the Shastra as the duties of the varnas, the ashramas, as well as the general conventions of dharma mentioned in the Dharma Shastras, worldly righteousness, meritorious action in general. So, with that, we'll come to verse 9. So we have anucitam ucitam va karma koyam vibhāgo bhagavati paramastam bhakti-yogo draḍhīyān kirati viṣam ahīndraḥ sāndra-pīyūṣam indur dvayam maheśo nirviśeṣaṁ vibharti. So this is a verse of Sri Vishnu Puripad, who wrote compiled an interesting text called the Bhakti Ratnakar? I'm forgetting the name now, but he compiled many citations from the Bhagavatam and other things to show that bhakti was the principal teaching of the Bhagavatam. A few of his verses are sometimes quoted by, in addition to the Padyavali, other of our Gaudiya acharyas have also cited some of his works on some occasions. Anyhow, here we have, what is the difference between improper and proper karma? May I have only steadfast practice of bhakti to Bhagavān. The king of snakes emits poison, and the moon condensed nectar. Still he, maheśo, indiscriminately carries them both. So this is a poem. It could sound a little cryptic, and it might not immediately be obvious what is the relationship between the different statements in the verse. In other words, to ask this question, there's no apparent answer given in the verse, so the answer is implied. And as we know, implied meaning is the life and the power of poetry. So the poet here is seeking to convey what he wants to say, principally through implied meaning. So what is the difference between improper and proper karma? This is what you call a rhetorical question. In other words, if persons are proposing multiple bad ideas at the same time, you say, what's the point of doing any of these? Where you're not actually trying to say that there is a point in doing them. You're saying, what is the point, to imply that there is no point and that they're not good ideas. So something like that, to say, what is the difference between proper and improper karma? He wants to say, there's no difference and we shouldn't bother with either of them. Rather, what should we do, or what do we aspire to? We want to have steadfast bhakti. And then how is it that one shall have that bhakti, and how shall one also function or deal in relation to the realm of karma? Then that's explained with this analogy of Lord Shiva, who is said to carry the moon and the king of snakes, namely Vasuki, who's known as sometimes the king of the Nagas. So we'll get into the implications of that in a minute. So if we look here in the discussion, I have some, the commentator, Sri Viracandra Gosvami Prabhupada, has given two different rather elaborate interpretations of this verse, and I've also given prior to that a little bit of a third. So, first of all, when we talk about this uchit and anucit, or proper and improper karma, this refers to conventionally what is known as dharma and adharma, or the actions enjoined for your varna, for your ashram, for human beings according to circumstances. This would be proper karma. And improper karma would be sins, crimes, things that are improper for people to do, either specific to their varna, specific to their ashram, or more broadly, specific to human beings in general. So, there might be an action which is wrong for all human beings, like stealing, and then there might be an action that's only wrong for certain human beings. Within the social context in which these poems are written, we're talking about the varnashram context, so certain actions are only meant to be done, let's say, by those who have certain samskaras. So those who don't have the upanayan samskara aren't meant to engage in study of the Veda. So if someone were to study the Veda without having received this samskara, that would be an improper action, but it would be improper specifically for them, not necessarily for everyone. So in that way, the notion of improper action or proper action has both a generality and also has a specificity to the circumstances of individuals. So what he wants to say is that there's no essential or important distinction between these two things, which for the society in which he wrote is a very bold statement, because this is essentially to say, what's the difference between, social work and crime? If you were to come along and say, what's the difference between, giving to charity and robbing people's houses? Hardly makes any difference. people would say, what are you talking about? So similarly, to say that there's no important distinction between performing the karma enjoined in the Shastra and performing the actions that are forbidden by the Shastra, this would seem almost like a crazy statement or a controversial statement. So what is the perspective from which he's speaking? This is the critical thing to grasp. So one way to summarize the perspective of this perception of non-distinction is what we call paramartha. So this is a term which refers to the ultimate aim or the ultimate object that is to be achieved in life or that can be achieved by a living being. So two actions might be better or worse or proper and improper according to a particular micro scale of interest, but from a much broader zoomed out view, it may not make any meaningful distinction. Just as, let's say, I don't know, an example is just coming off the top of my head. Let's say someone is in a terrible war and disease-ridden place, which is extremely unlivable, and people want to leave that place. Then, if you're in that place, being like a little closer or a little further from the border hardly matters. But once you get over the border, you're safe. Some circumstance like this, it means to say that things that can liberate you from illusion, from suffering, from samsara, that matters. That is of substance. But things that can get you like a little better status in the prison than the other, from the perspective of someone who just wants to be out of prison, whether you have a prison cell on the corner of the block or the middle of the block is not going to make that much difference. So it's a non-distinction perceived in a way that still accommodates the notion of distinction between them. So he's not saying there's absolutely no difference between them, but he's saying as far as what ultimately matters, or from this broad perspective, there's no practical distinction. So I've mentioned here one payar in the Charitamrita where it says that both pious karma and impious karma are considered part of the jiva's ignorance. In other words, because neither one in and of themselves can liberate the jiva from the influence of maya, from the being subject to the absence of the awareness of Bhagavān, then they're both part of the problem. They're both part of the darkness rather than means to alleviating the darkness. So in that sense, there's no truly meaningful distinction between them. So then the second line, the prayer, may I have steadfast bhakti, is his expression of this is what is meaningful, this is the paramartha, this is what is truly important. I want only to have bhakti. I'm not concerned with either following the conventional injunctions for worldly life or with simply avoiding the forbidden behaviors in life. So it's an expression of indifference towards these two things. So by indifference, also, it doesn't necessarily mean that he completely rejects these activities, but that he's not attached to them. So the import is not necessarily that he'll never perform another action that's something a law-abiding human being would do, or that he might not even ever again perform some of the duties of his varna or his ashram. He might, but he won't perceive those things to have any ultimate meaning, or he won't identify himself as meaningfully being the performer of those actions. Rather, he'll perform them without aversion or attachment to them. According to the necessity of circumstance, he may perform them, but what he's resolute upon, what he's desirous of, is only bhakti. This is the spirit of the expression. So to convey that sense of simultaneous retention and non-attachment, he uses this example of Lord Shiva. So for everyone who's seen, art and so forth depicting Lord Shiva, they can observe that he wears a snake around his shoulders, which sometimes has its hood poised beside his head, and that usually up in his matted locks we find some image of the crescent moon. So these two elements, the snake is named Vasuki, and the moon, is named Chandra. So there's some Puranic background to how these two elements, the moon and the snake, came to dwell upon the shoulders and the head of Shiva. And I did a little digging on this, but I couldn't satisfy my inquiry fully. But I did find a passage in the Shiva Puran which directly describes some of it, but I felt like there must be some accounts in some other Puranas that shed a bit more light on it, but I wasn't able to track down the actual source text. Looking online, you can find loads of people telling you all these stories, but hardly anyone actually quotes any source for what they're saying. So I may do a little further research on this, but anyway, the gist of the situation is that Vasuki was used as the rope in the churning of the ocean, which is described in the Bhagavatam, the Vishnu Puran, and other texts. And it's not mentioned in the Bhagavatam, but in other texts, there's some mention that after the churning or in the process of the churning, Vasuki was having it rough. In other words, as this churning was going on, that's, obviously some pressure on the body, and on top of that, when the halahal poison was released, flames, gas, etc. is all coming out, then this was taking a toll on him. And by some account or another, it said that Lord Shiva was impressed or was satisfied with the grunt of the work that Vasuki was bearing, and to reward him or to relieve him, he gave Vasuki a place upon himself. So what the poet here is emphasizing is that Shiva wasn't wearing this or taking Vasuki on himself because he had something to gain from that, or he wanted that specifically for himself, but rather that as an act of respect, as an act of duty, he gave this position to Vasuki. So he's indifferent to it. He's not doing it in any kind of self-interested manner. And similarly, Chandra, the histories of Chandra, both in the Bhagavatam and elsewhere, are a little scandalous. There's an instance in which he was caught having an affair with Brihaspati, and, oh no, network problem. Sorry, one sec. He was caught having an affair with Brihaspati, and then afterwards he is said to have, with Brihaspati's wife, Tara, and also he was said to have married the 27 daughters of Daksha. So these are known as the nakshatras, or the zodiac through which the moon moves throughout the sky. These zones of 13.3 degrees that make up the 360-degree zodiac from the viewpoint of the Earth. These sections are each given names and are known as nakshatras, and they're said to be the 27 daughters of Daksha. So Daksha married these 27 daughters to the moon. Looks like we're getting a bit of rain here, so some issues with the lights and the internet. Anyway, hopefully it's smooth to some extent. Daksha married his 27 daughters to Chandra. But after the marriage, Chandra favored Rohini, one particular daughter, one particular nakshatra, he seemed to favor the most, and this was disappointing to the rest of the sisters. So they complained to their father. The father was very upset by this partiality and behavior on the part of Chandra. So in anger, he cursed Chandra, that he would lose his luster. So then Chandra was very disturbed by this, so he sought shelter in Lord Shiva, and then Lord Shiva sought to support him, but also didn't want to completely contradict the curse of Daksha. So it then became that the moon waxed and waned, and for a period of time would lose his luster and then regain his luster, lose his luster, regain his luster. And this is a Puranic explanation for the waxing and the waning of the moon. And Shiva, in his granting of shelter and support to Chandra, accepted him on his crown. Something loosely like this is described. So on this basis, we have this idea that the moon resides on the crown of Shiva. So these are the background of how this point is being made by the author. So here what the author is saying is that Shiva didn't take Chandra on his own crown for his own interest, he didn't take Vasuki on his shoulders for his own interest, but to support them in for their needs, he accepted these things. So in that way, he bears them, but indiscriminately or indifferently, as an act of responsibility, an act of duty, he being of capability to shelter and support them, so he does it in this spirit. So to convey this detached, indiscriminate support that Shiva offers to the moon and Vasuki, he's using then that rather as a metaphor. So he's saying similarly, I'm not attached to proper or improper karma, I'm only interested in bhakti. But as per my circumstances, I may also, bear the responsibility of engaging in particular types of activity as required. Let it be. In other words, as Shiva dutifully holds these upon his head, so I also take on whatever worldly circumstances, whatever worldly responsibilities are called of me, but my desire, my focus, my aspiration is bhakti alone. This is the general thrust of the verse. So I'm going to come now to some of the interpretations that the commentator has given. And first, the main distinction of how the two different comments come up is based on the word in the verse vibhāgo. So if we look at the end of the first line, the way it's been translated in the basic translation, the word vibhāgo means a distinction or a difference. So what is the difference between proper and improper karma? So this is kind of the, apatshruta meaning, or the meaning as you would hear it or expect it. But the commentator gives some different interpretation of the word vibhāgo, and thereby some different understanding of the general meaning of the verse. So, the way that he takes it, first of all, is he takes the word vibhāgo to mean sevanam, or viṣeṣa sevanam, meaning that, I'll just read as I've given it here. If his prayer is, let me have only steadfast bhakti, then an objection may be raised. If you engage in nothing but bhakti to Bhagavān, then you may incur the sin of neglecting compulsory duties and performing forbidden actions. So you say you want bhakti alone, then what about your karma? Will you not incur sin because of neglecting your karma? So then the bhakta replies that I'm not attached to the fruits. I'll just read it. It says, if under the influence of my prarabdha karma, I who am not attached to the fruits of my actions, perform an improper action, such as eating what ought not to be eaten, or perform proper actions, such as the compulsory and incidental duties of my varna and ashram, what significant involvement occurs thereby? Or what great service or action or participation have I taken in anything? None, because I'm not attached to these things. Therefore, no harm shall ensue, even if I do not perform actions enjoined by my varna and ashram, or I do perform forbidden actions. In other words, when he doesn't have the ego of being the doer, then the results of the action don't accrue to him. So he says, prarabdha karma alone is the cause of all performance of such actions on my part. And I foster no sense of identification with my varna, my ashram, or any other worldly responsibility. So this is in the spirit of the phrase Naham Vipro, the verse said to be spoken by Mahaprabhu, which comes later in the Padyavali, so we'll discuss that sometime ahead. So to convey this sense of non-attachment. Whatever's happening, it's my prarabdha karma, I accept it, I don't identify with it, I'm not attached to it. Just as Shiva carries Vasuki, he carries Chandra upon himself. So from time to time, according to my prarabdha karma, I might do something that produces nectar, the way pious karma produces some worldly benefits. Or I might do something that produces poison, the way the snake can produce poison. I might do something that causes suffering. But in either case, I'm not attached. So this is one interpretation. And then the second interpretation is as follows. May my improper action in the form of offerings for my own pleasure, which are unsuitable for Bhagavān's service, because of their fundamental motivation, because their fundamental motivation is personal pleasure rather than Bhagavān's pleasure, and my proper action in the form of offerings that are directly suitable for his service, that is, that are made for his pleasure and constituted of elements known to be pleasing to him, both be connected to Bhagavān. So here, he's in this second interpretation, he's interpreting the word karma not as referent to the Dharma Shastras and all this, but as karma as actions related or actions done in connection with Bhagavān. So, quote, proper actions would be actions that are known to be pleasing to him, involving elements that are considered pleasing to him, and, quote, improper actions would be actions that are not done with the primary purpose of pleasing him or with elements that are known to be pleasing to him particularly. Nevertheless, even that, quote, improper action of making an offering to him or doing something for him, it's improper in the sense that it's not necessarily done according to the proper procedure or not necessarily done with the ideal motivation, but nevertheless it is an act of an offering or an act related to Bhagavān. So what difference is there between these two things? So now he gives a set of reasons related to this. He says, given that they are both being done only on the order of Sri Bhagavān, since he has instructed that whatever one does, one should offer it to him in the Bhagavad Gita and elsewhere. Yad karoshi yad ashnasi yad dehoshi yad dehoshi dilasiyat yad tapasishi konteya tat karusha mararparam. He's referring to this verse in the Gita. And actually, he quotes 4 or 5 verses, but just to keep it short, I didn't include them all here. So if Bhagavān says, whatever you do, offer it to me, then someone might do something that fundamentally they're motivated to do just because they want to do it, but okay, I should offer it to Bhagavān, so I'm offering it to Bhagavān. So although it's improper, it's also has merit to it in the sense that it's still done and still offered to Bhagavān. And secondly, neither of them are a cause of bondage and samsara. So when you make offerings to Bhagavān, that's something that is liberating you from samsara, even if your lower motivation for doing it is there. Even if you have no motivation for doing it. We hear in the Bhakti Sandarbha examples of what they call bhakti-abhas, or activities of bhakti that were done entirely unintentionally. A bird getting carried in the mouth of a dog around a temple is credited for doing parikrama. similarly, a rat or a mouse is eating the ghee out of a wick that's burning in a temple, and then its mouth catches on fire, and then it's trying to get the wick out of its mouth, but it's as if it's waving the wick in front of the Thakur as an offering. So it also was benefited, and that's considered an act of bhakti. So even these, quote, improper actions are also causes of that are leading towards liberation from samsara. And third, both are causes rather of continuous pleasure for Bhagavān. In other words, Bhagavān even derives some satisfaction from these things. Or the example is cited in Hari Bhakti Vilas and the Bhakti Sandarbha about Prahlad. In a previous life was known as Vasudeva, and he had gone to a temple of Nrsimha that was dilapidated in the outskirts of a village in order to consort with a woman, but he happened to sweep the floor for the sake of doing that. But nevertheless, that was perceived as an act of service to the temple deity. So, in other words, because these things can still please Bhagavān, because they don't cause bondage in samsara, and because they're done as per Bhagavān's orders, then they're also acceptable as practices or acts of bhakti. So therefore, what's the difference between them? They're all acceptable as such. So then the objection comes, well, this prayer implies that Sri Bhagavān will accept these offerings, even those that are done fundamentally for my own pleasure and not made up of elements that are known to be pleasing to him. Sri Bhagavān, however, is fully complete and satisfied in and of himself. But this notion that he accepts such offerings, since he is fully complete in himself, so a contradiction to his completeness and so forth, are created by this notion that he accepts such offerings, since he has no need to do so. So the objection is, you might do these acts of bhakti abhas, but why would Bhagavān be bothered with them? Bhagavān is aptakam, atmaram, he's completely satisfied in himself. He has no need for any of this. What to speak of these things that aren't even really, ideal forms of bhakti anyway? Why would he even bother to accept these things? So the reply is given, it's true. Bhagavān is atmaram, aptakam, complete, self-satisfied, independent, etc. But as such, he can still accept these things, not because he needs them, but as an expression of his completeness, as an expression of his own bliss, he can also appreciate them. He can also accept them from his bhaktas. So there's no contradiction. And then the example of Shiva is in that respect. Shiva is at peace. He is self-content within himself. Still, he accepts Vasuki, he accepts Chandra to favor them, not out of a need for himself. So this is the second interpretation, where in essence, the concepts of proper and improper karma are referring to quote-unquote proper and improper expressions of bhakti, or semblances of bhakti. So he's saying, ultimately there's no difference between either one, because Bhagavān, in his graciousness and completeness, will accept them both. So, in that way, the meaning of the verse is explained. So what do we derive from this? What is the main point? The prakaran is the greatness of bhakti. So what is the greatness of bhakti? The greatness of bhakti that's being explained here is that it is worthy of being the sole ideal of one's life. That this is the ideal that I cherish, this is the practice that I wish to engage in, and let me be indifferent to all else. And at the same time, let me carry on in the midst of elements of the other, as required according to my circumstance, without attachment or excessive aversion, but simply in a steady, composed manner, similar to the way Lord Shiva has to appease and deal with so many asuras and other things, but he's tranquil in the midst of carrying on these activities. So along these lines, we have this verse of Vishnu Puri Pad. So giving a contrast, one way, the meaning then is a contrast between bhakti and karma, and another way, conveying the ultimate value or the greatness of bhakti as being most valuable even when it's done improperly, and that Bhagavān accepts it as such. So I think I'll conclude here for today. There's a lot of wind and rain pouring outside, so I think the internet and the electric connection are wavering on and off. So just to avoid any possible further disconnection or interruption. And then I'll leave it at that. And in our next discussion, we'll come to the following verse in this section about the greatness of bhajan, the greatness of worship of Krishna, whereby it is explained how the acts of worship of Krishna are the very essence of all dharma. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe.